Close to last call for the media archives videos of all the talks. It's $5 for a single talk, $40 for all of the conference, so make sure to show them some love and take home videos of your favorite speakers. You might get to see Amit's stage jump on film, so, you know, it's like an action movie, kind of. Other than that, Dennis, are you ready? Okay, perfect. The last talk of LayerOne is Sanders Smith with Won't Somebody Please Think of the Routers? So give him some love.
So I'm Sanders Smith, and I'm going to talk to you about security problems with home routers. We're going to look at why home networking is so problematic and talk about some things that can be done to try and fix the problem. So I've been building software for 31 years now, worked in 3 different countries. I built big systems, small systems, worked on more platforms than I want to remember. A few years ago, I founded Sericon Technology in Toronto. So I want to say thank you to whoever designed these badges. So when I fly back to Toronto, I get to explain to the TSA and to Canada Customs why this is not a bomb. So we built a tool called RouterCheck that allows ordinary people to run a sophisticated security scan of their home network. And this is not a sales presentation. I just mentioned our tool because we're going to use the data that I've found from using the tool, from having our customers use our tool and run it on their home networks, to form our opinions that I'm going to share with you and everything that we're doing. So about 3 years ago, I noticed that there were reports about home routers being unsafe. And I thought this was a good opportunity to do something meaningful and interesting. So since then, I've been working on this. So if you want to know how people are really using and configuring their home routers, we're good people to talk to and know. So there's some really interesting cases of large-scale hacks against home routers. Back in 2012, a guy in Brazil compromised 4.5 million devices. And what he did is he was modifying the DNS settings to point to some rogue advertising servers. So the people who were affected were being served ads from an ad network that was run by criminals. And before he was caught, he ended up making $50,000, which is really not a lot of money, considering that he trashed 4.5 million devices. And the interesting thing was the whole point of doing this exercise is he wanted to fund his visits to prostitutes in Rio. So this quote from this researcher in Brazil is very good. He says, "The negligence of the manufacturers, the neglect of the ISPs, and the arrogance of official government agencies create a perfect storm enabling cyber criminals to attack at will." And this is going to be a common theme where it's not just one thing that fails, it's a whole bunch of things that fail. Then in 2014, there were thousands of routers that were attacked in Poland. And again, they modified people's DNS settings, but it was really to redirect the request to the Polish banking sites. And they tried to man in the middle of these sites in order to steal banking credentials. So this is a really good example of real criminal activity that was aimed at home networks. And then at Christmas of 2014, the Lizard Squad took over 40,000 routers worldwide. They did not attack DNS. Instead, what they did was they used the routers to run DDoS attacks on Xbox Live and PlayStation Network, and it really pissed off all the kids who just got their new consoles for Christmas and couldn't connect to these services and play their new games. And now you think that there'd be some really sophisticated hacking attack that was used to control 40,000 home networks, but it really wasn't. The routers were compromised because people never changed their default passwords, and then they just got taken over. This is also going to be a really common theme that we see. Now, we've even coined a term for these types of attacks. We say that a hack of mass destruction occurs when hackers are able to compromise large numbers of home networks because they're able to take advantage of some common flaw in all these networks. Please feel free to use this term where you find it appropriate. Now, there are lots of people looking at this problem to try and fix it. There are a lot of security professionals looking through router firmware, trying to find security bugs, and very often they're successful. Across the hall, there was just the fail of things, this is what they were trying to do. They were trying to break into routers and IoT devices and stuff like that. One of the more common known contests for doing this was So Hopelessly Broken, which started 2 years ago at DEF CON 22. And they started the contest to break into 15 routers and found loads and loads of vulnerabilities. Now, I have a lot of respect for these guys, and they do really great work, but the truth is they aren't making such a big impact on actually solving the home network security problem. And to understand why this is, we have to look at the general plan of what they're trying to do. So this general plan has been around for a while, and it's been used other places, and it's pretty well documented. People understand it. There are 3 phases involved. So phase 1 is we look for vulnerabilities, and there are a lot of people who are really great at phase 1. That's not a problem at all. We can find vulnerabilities anywhere we want, any amount of vulnerabilities we want. Phase 2 is a little bit different because it's really not so well defined. We just have this general belief that once vendors are told that there's a security vulnerability in their product, they're going to do something about it. And phase 2 obviously leads to phase 3, where all the routers become very secure, everybody is safe, and everything is great. But the problem here is phase 2. It relies on the actions of vendors, and we really have no control over that. Now, before I started looking into this problem, I sort of naively thought I understood what happened when vendors were told that there's a security problem in thousands of devices that they built. And I imagine that once a vendor learned about the security vulnerability, they would send some signal out into the sky, sort of like the bat signal. And when they see this, embedded system developers all over the city convene on some underground bunker, and they have access to computers and diagnostic tools and hot pockets and everything that they need. And within 48 hours, a fix is created, it's tested, and it's loaded onto all the problematic devices around the world. But this doesn't happen. In reality, when vendors are told about reports of vulnerabilities in their devices, the resulting action is often do nothing. A lot of times the security researchers who find it don't even get an email back from the vendors who have the problem. Now, phase 2 is indeed a problem, but we can ask questions like, in reality, how bad is it really? And to answer that question, we need data from real home networks. Unfortunately, our router check tool gives us this data, which can show us what the real state of the world of home networking is. And I apologize, you probably can't read it all, so I'll just summarize it. We published this data a few months ago in a white paper that's available on our website. So if you really want to see it, go download the white paper. About half the routers that we tested have WPS turned on, even though WPS was cracked several years ago and is not secure at all. Almost half of the routers respond to a ping from the internet, which I've yet to figure out what value there is in responding to a ping from the internet, except to let hackers know that there's actually some device that's responding there. A third of home networks still use the default password, which obviously is really bad. A lot of outdated encryption is being used. RouterCheck also tests for popular vulnerabilities like the misfortune cookie bug, which you may have heard of and was found at the end of 2014. We do some checking for these coding vulnerabilities, but in truth, their numbers are small compared to the configuration vulnerabilities that we find. And this is the real story. The real problem is poor configuration. And yes, hackers can go after the devices that have buffer overflows and all kinds of other problems like that. But you know, why would they, when it's so much easier to go attack something that doesn't even have a password? And it's not like these things are hard to find. They're pretty easy to find. And when a device on the internet is problematic, the truth is all of us are the ones who pay the price. And it's not just your grandmother who's having trouble. It's your dad and your sister-in-law and the guy down the street. And the worst part is a compromised router is really hard to detect. So if somebody notices that things are acting funny, they'll go and they'll take their laptop and they'll take it to the Geek Squad, and who knows what happens there, but they're bound to find something wrong with the laptop. But the problem with the router is going to persist, and it's going to be there for a long time, and no one's even going to know about it. Now, despite what Kevin Mitnick might say, the truth is these people really aren't stupid. It's not a stupid problem. They've really just been thrown into a situation where they're set up to fail. So as an example, I ran a little experiment, and I looked at people's SSIDs. For those of you who don't know, SSIDs are Wi-Fi names, the things that people name their wireless networks. And everyone's seen this. There are lots of pages on the internet, they're easy to find, where people list funny Wi-Fi names. This one's from Pinterest. There's Girls Gone Wireless and Abraham Linksys. A lot of good funny ones. And I looked through my router check data to see what my users were using. My favorite one is I'm Brian and so is my wife. And if you don't know what that is, come talk to me later. There's some good stuff you can see. And of course there's It Burns When I Pee. And we not only have this in our data, my users have 7 different variations. 7 different variations of It Burns When I Pee. So you can ask, you know, what does it all mean? And like a lot of things in life, it really doesn't mean anything. It's just people trying to be funny. But during the whole exercise, I found another class of SSIDs. And these were angrier. You imagine the old man shaking his fist and saying, "You kids, get off of my Wi-Fi!" But there's a difference here. When I look at the configuration of these networks against the rest of my users' configuration, these guys have far more configuration problems than my typical user. Bad passwords, open ports, no encryption, invitations for mischief. And this does mean something, because people are really the weak link here. And the unfortunate thing is they can get angry, but nobody gets angry enough to actually get their router manual out and read it and understand what you can do to keep the kid next door out of your network. So we can ask, why is home networking so confusing to people? And we all know this guy. He's not stupid, but he really doesn't understand what's going on. And these are the types of people that get all excited because, Chevrolet now sells you cars with Wi-Fi built into it. And you go to them and you say, if I need Wi-Fi in my car, I pull out my phone and I turn on a hotspot and bam, I've got Wi-Fi in my car. And they say, no, your hotspot uses data. These cars have Wi-Fi. I'm like, okay, at that time it's time to stop because you're just not going to get anywhere. And, this is not an exception. This is lots of people out there who are like that. So what are the problems that cause this behavior? Well, clearly there's too much jargon that we use that people don't understand. they're bad user interfaces. And an example of this that I always think about is very often there are values in the user interface that you can change to change something that's buried really deep in the TCP/IP stack, like some esoteric value for how a Wi-Fi radio works. And these values are given the same prominence of something that you really want people to focus on, like their DNS settings. So you have this democratization of the interface where everything looks like it's valued the same way, it has the same importance, and users look at it and they don't even know what to focus on. They don't know what's important, and they don't make sure that the things that are important really get set, and that's a problem. Routers lie. A lot of people don't know this, but there are a whole lot of routers out there. If you change something in the user interface, the router then just goes and ignores whatever you said. So this happens a lot with WPS, where some routers let you think that you've actually turned it off, but if you really go check, it's still turned on, which is really bad because WPS is a security problem. There's also no standard way of doing anything on these devices. So for things like port forwarding or parental controls, if you have it set up on one router and you move to another, good luck, you have to start all over how to figure out what to do. And of course, these things have pretty bad documentation. So when it comes to vulnerabilities that are actually built into the code, it's easy to see how we got there. The margins on consumer networking equipment are really small, so vendors try to save money any way they can. Embedded system developers always look at the pennies. They take a lot of shortcuts, and that creates problematic code. Everybody uses lots of open source code, and open source code does have bugs in it, Heartbleed, and it's used by a lot of vendors. So what happens is when bugs are found, they tend to go across models, and they tend to go across vendors. So a lot of times you'll find a vulnerability, and you'll see that it exists in D-Link and Linksys and Netgear, and you say, you know, how does that happen? Well, it's probably an open source bug. In a lot of cases, I don't even understand how this happens, but a lot of ancient open source code gets found in these devices, and of course the old ancient source code has a lot of bugs that have been fixed in more modern versions, but it doesn't really matter because, you know, that's what the vendor put in. And finally, vendors tend not to do too much testing of the security of their devices, to the dismay of many security professionals. And that last statement is really important, so it deserves its own slide. Now, to a lot of people, this is motherhood and apple pie, but we disagree. Not enough security people being involved is a problem, but it's really not the problem for now. The biggest problem that we see is a lack of focus on user experience and user interface. And that really is what's causing home networking to have so many security problems. So who's to blame? Vendors? Yes. Tech community for allowing things to become far too complex? Yes. Some people are really proud of the fact that they don't know anything about computers, and I've never understood that, but yeah, that's a problem. And it's really everybody. But there's hope, and things can be fixed. We just need to do it the right way. So this is how a lot of people start in trying to fix the problem. They'll build a web page to tell average people how to make their home networks more secure. And there are hundreds of pages on the internet that are just like this. And in fact, if you go to routercheck.com, you see that we have one that's just like this. I don't know if it's 10 tips or 7 tips or 12 tips. We definitely tell you to change your default password and a bunch of other things. But how effective is this really? You know, just telling people what to do, how effective is that? So I like to look at things that are similar and see how well they fared. So some of you may remember the Just Say No campaign, started by Mrs. Reagan in the mid-'80s to address the growing drug problem. She realized that you could solve the drug problem by convincing elementary and middle school kids to just say no if they were offered drugs. And they made t-shirts and buttons and bumper stickers, and Mrs. Reagan sat on Mr. T's lap, and they didn't really solve anything. And the other thing that I really like to look at is the religious right convinces Bristol Palin to be their spokesperson for their abstinence-only agenda. So that's what she goes out and preaches, even after she conceived and gave birth to 2 children entirely out of wedlock. Did she convince kids not to have premarital sex? No. So simply telling people do things that you believe are in their best interests generally doesn't work, because people don't work that way. You need to do more to expect a positive outcome. So let's look at things that are working. Yeah, I know. Government intervention. But the truth is, it is working if we think that vendor indifference is a problem. Now, Wi-Fi routers contain radio transmitters, so they're under the jurisdiction of the FCC. And the FCC publishes regulations on how they operate so that there's no interference with other things. So apparently, Wi-Fi has the potential to interfere with some systems that the FAA relies on. If you go and you buy a router at Best Buy, it's guaranteed to work within the FCC's guidelines. But some people like to modify their devices. And there's a whole community out there of people writing and using third-party router firmware. There are lots of it out there. There's DDWRT and Tomato and Gargoyle. And the problem is this software has the potential to push the Wi-Fi radio transmitters into an unsafe state so that they can interfere with something. So back in September 2015, the FCC released some proposed legislation which would effectively outlaw open source router firmware. And as can be expected, the open source router firmware community didn't like that. And they quickly mobilized themselves and petitioned the FCC to change their decision. And one of the biggest arguments that they made was that open source firmware is important to support because it's really a lot more secure than the stock firmware that comes out of a box. So eventually a compromise was reached. And starting on June 2nd, which is a few days from now, open source firmware is allowed to be loaded onto consumer routers as long as the router vendor puts precautions in place so that the radios never go into an unsafe state, regardless of what the software tells it to do. And it's interesting to see how vendors are reacting to this decision. Of course, if we remember back to phase 2, vendors are indifferent to anything that's going on. So TP-Link, as an example, which is the largest manufacturer out there, takes the easy way out. And they said they're going to change the routers so that no open source firmware can be loaded onto them. And they put up their hands and they say, problem solved. I don't really think that's a good solution, but that's their solution. On the other hand, Linksys is being much more proactive and user-friendly. And what they're doing is they're working with their chip manufacturers to ensure that everything stays in the safe zone, even if the software tries to drive the chips into something that's not going to be safe. So big thumbs up to Linksys. And overall, it's good to see that vendors can be moved into taking action, and maybe phase 2 is not as intractable a problem as we originally thought. And the FCC isn't the only government entity that's being involved with consumer routers. In February this year, the Federal Trade Commission fined and punished ASUS for some really poor security practices that put people's data security and privacy in jeopardy. So what ASUS did was they had this feature on their router that allowed people to put a USB hard drive into the router, which could then be accessed from across a network. And you can see where this is heading. Unfortunately, the security for accessing these devices was really, really bad. And hackers had a field day. They broke into lots of people's private data. And in a lot of cases, they even left behind some files that told the people that their data had been breached. And they kind of mocked them, which was really kind of nasty. Anyway, the FTC did not like this at all. And the FTC is tasked with helping to ensure people's privacy. So they hit ASUS with a bunch of fines, and they put some sanctions in place to force them to take their security more seriously. And if you see what ASUS has been doing recently, they're actually doing something. And I don't think the FTC is really going to stop there. I'm aware that they've been looking at a lot of the data that we've published, and I've spoke with them on a few occasions, and it's my feeling that they're going to start getting more into the business of trying to protect home networking, which I think is really positive. So government intervention is one way to address the problem. And I want to talk about what we and some other companies are also doing to try and address this problem. So we realize that some adult supervision is really necessary here. And what I mean by that is the adults who are configuring their home routers really need to be supervised. So one way to do it is to create some software agents that can scan the router and look for vulnerabilities and bad configuration choices. And these agents can be built into router firmware, or they can be delivered as a third-party tool. So Router Check is an agent like that, like this. It's a third-party tool, but there are others. There's a tool called Home Network Security. It's part of the Avast antivirus suite. Many people are also familiar with it. It's a web app called Shields Up. It's a good tool, but the only thing it really tests are things that are accessible from outside the firewall. So very common problems like bad passwords and no encryption are not going to be found by them. And then I recently downloaded a tool from ASUS. It's a smartphone app that allows you to configure their routers. And it has this feature, it's a security scan. I was a little bit impressed with it. It's nicely done, but it only seems to look at the settings that the router has, and it really doesn't do a true scan. So if the router is lying to you because it's been infected and it's telling you what it wants you to know and not what it's really doing, it really isn't so accurate. But it's a start, and it's really good to see that there are people who are building tools to take this stuff seriously. So what is it that we do? Well, everything starts here. You have a web page, you have a router manual, whatever, that tells you, hey, if you want to use wireless encryption, which you should be using WPA2. But we've already seen that just doing this is not going to work. So what you need to do is you need to hold the mirror up for people and actually show them that something is wrong. So people who set their routers to use WEP, they need to be told, hey, you're using WEP. And we may even need to make it a little bit clear that this is a bad choice. And I really like the look on her face here because it's this great combination of disbelief and disgust, which you really should be giving to anybody who chooses to use WEP on their router. And you can tell them that it's no longer the year 2001. And 2001 is important because 2001 is when security researchers figured out that there were fundamental problems with the WEP protocol. And that's when they started to build tools to break into networks that were secured with WEP. And I'm sure I don't have to tell you guys where to find these tools. They're pretty easy to find. So let's put this in perspective. WEP has not been a safe choice for 15 years. That's 2 Ravens Super Bowl victories ago, and people are still using it. Our data shows that 2% of my users are using WEP, and you can ask, why? And this is why. This is the interface of your typical router. It's a Linksys, but it's kind of irrelevant. I could have chosen any vendor, any model of any vendor, really. And my encryption choices here are WEP, WPA Personal, WPA2 Personal, WPA Enterprise, WPA2 Enterprise, Radius, and Disabled. And what is the right choice? And I know that you guys know what the right choice is, but does the average guy out there know what the right choice is? And to them and loads of other people, one of these selections looks just as good as any other selection. There's really no explanation or any help given to help them give the right choice. And this is why 2% of my users are using a protocol that's been obsolete for 15 years. And to be really honest, I'm surprised that number is not more. All right, so let's recap. We show the user what they're doing wrong. We possibly mock them, but we really don't do that because we like our users. And now there's one more thing to do, which is give them some instruction to help them fix their problem. And this is not easy to do. This is hard. But we figured out some tricks for doing this, and we've seen some positive results. So it's doable because despite having very different interfaces, the high-level descriptions for how to solve simple router configuration problems, they have a lot of similarities that go across models. And we've been kind of successful with this, and our data shows that users who are told about configuration problems and then they seek help to actually fix them really do fix them. And we can see that in our data when they do subsequent checks. They come out with fewer vulnerabilities than previously we found. So as long as I'm here and I have this forum, it's worthwhile to talk about some really simple things that vendors can do to make us all safer. So first of all, why do consumer routers allow unconstrained password guessing? I did some testing on this, and a typical router will very happily respond to a few million automated guesses for passwords every day. So this can allow a hacker to use a compromised device on the network to try and break into the router all day and all night for, as long as you want. My estimates is you can do about 300 million password guesses per month. And as we said before, these things are really hard to detect that we have a router problem, so that can go on for, months and months. So why, after 3 bad guesses, slow the response down? Instead of responding within milliseconds, take 10 seconds to respond. Why do we still allow anything to operate that still uses a default password? This is pretty easy to fix. just don't allow internet access until the default password's been changed. As I talked about before, why does my dad's router need to respond to pings from the internet? A lot of routers come out of the box with this turned on, and it seems kind of stupid to me. We also talked about help in choosing a proper encryption method. No vendor really does this well. No one really explains what's going on and gives you help to decide which one to choose. And WPS is broken. It's been broken for a few years now. There are tools available to steal passwords. If you have a network that's WPS enabled, why not just turn it off by default? But there's some hope for the future. There are some new non-traditional vendors that are popping up. For instance, Google OnHub and Eero. They've been getting a lot of attention the last few months. How will they fare security-wise? I'll be honest and say I really don't know. It remains to be seen, but I'm hopeful. And that's really the end of my presentation. So I'll be very happy to answer any questions that you have. Yes, sir. So the question is, why do routers have WP as an option at all? To be honest, I don't know. You can come up with all kinds of really crazy reasons. So for instance, somebody may have some device that they want to connect to it that's 15 years old, and the only thing that it supports is WEP, in which case you really don't have a choice. But that's kind of an extreme case. So why don't vendors take it out? I don't know. They have the code. The code works properly. It does the protocol the way the protocol is supposed to work. It's just the protocol is fundamentally flawed. So why don't they take it out? They probably will create more problems taking it out than just leaving it in. I agree. Again, we rely on the vendors. Yes?
What role do service providers potentially play in that? I mean, one would think that they can fix everything, but at least they can, scan for vulnerabilities against their customers, and that they've got a direct pathway.
Okay, that's a good question. The question was, what role do service providers what role do they play in this? Actually, a lot of routers out there are modified by the ISPs. When I first started writing router check, I thought all I would see is Linksys and ND-Link and Netgear and the 10 biggest vendors that are out there. And the truth is, that's not what I normally see. Most of the routers that I see are coming from vendors who are selling to the ISPs, and then people just, it's there and it works, so they'll use it. So I'm seeing a lot of things that you may not even heard of, SNC and Aris, and in Europe there's something called Fritzbox, which is really popular in Germany. I see lots and lots of that stuff. In Britain there's BT Hub, and there's Virgin something. I don't remember what that one's called. But anyway, these are all devices that the ISPs have. They then modify them to be particular to their network or whatever it is they want it to do, and they give it to their users, and their users are just simply using that. So the vendors actually introduce some vulnerabilities sometimes, which is really unfortunate. As far as checking the route, as far as checking the routers from the ISP side, I really don't know of any that actually do that. Again, all they would really have access to is stuff that's outside of the firewall. They don't really have access to anything inside the firewall, which is really important, unless they also give you some kind of antivirus software, and then they can possibly build in something like we've done with RouterCheck to build the same type of system to do scanning. Yeah.
What role could an operating system play? So, I mean, could Windows security tool also do some, stuff, or could Mac OS do some stuff tapping into the, capabilities built into the devices on the inside?
So the question is, can Windows or Mac do something to help the problem? Not really. They could do the same thing that we're doing with RouterCheck and Avast is doing with their home network security product. They could build the same type of system, but as far as having this at the operating system level, it really doesn't buy you anything because you're interacting with this thing from across a network. So it's really not going to be any better than things that I can build. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, exactly. Well, I would say that if you have shiny antennas, that's probably worth the price of whatever you paid. That's important. If you have a USB port on a router, I would not plug anything into it. That's a really bad idea. As far as end-of-lifing products, that happens all the time, and end-of-lifing a router product a lot of times happens when it's first released, because if you don't release any new software for it, it's essentially end of life. As far as DDWRT and open source software, I agree with you that the people who are putting this on their devices, they know what they're doing. And in fact, the time when the FCC proposed their legislation to kind of outlaw third-party open source routing firmware, I did talk to some of the people in the open source community, the ones who were at the head trying to convince the FCC that this was a bad idea. And these people are really passionate, and they're really proactive, and if they do find a security problem with their code, they are going to fix it pretty soon, because You know, it's not just something that they're building to sell, it's they're building to use themselves, and if you want to use it, they're very happy about it. So are there any other questions? Yes. Okay, so the question is, if you want to be safe, is turning off the SSID broadcast a good idea or a bad idea? So we really need to understand that when you're talking about home networking, a home router, there are two vulnerabilities here. There's stuff that's local and there's stuff that's anywhere. So stuff that's local is people trying to get onto your network. Break into the encryption if you have encryption, and that's people just in your neighborhood. You know, 2 houses over is about as far as you can go to try and break into somebody's router, but you always have to assume that the kid next door has access to all the tools that you can find on the internet, which are not that hard to find. So turning off SSID will be good for those types of attacks. But then there are the other attacks where people can try and attack you from anywhere in the world because you really are a node on the internet, and it doesn't matter if you're next door or you're, you know, somewhere in Eastern Europe or anywhere really. There are things that you should do to take precautions to make sure that you're safe from those types of attacks. So those are things like turning off ping, if you can turn off ping, making sure that you have a good password, making sure that you don't do something completely idiotic like enable remote administration, which of course is an option on all these devices, and that's possibly the worst option you can possibly use. Also opening ports. What other things can I think of that you want to do? Basically what you really want to do is go find one of those hundreds of pages on the internet that tell you here's how you make your network more safe, and just follow those rules. And you know, it's kind of the thing where if you're in the woods and you know, you're there with your buddy and a bear comes and you stop to put your shoes on, and your buddy says to you, you know, why are you putting your shoes on? You're not going to outrun the bear. And you say, I don't have to outrun the bear, I have to outrun you. So if you are more safe than everybody else on the internet, it's unlikely you'll get attacked. Anybody else? Yes.
Wondering, if we're looking at companies, even if they do update their firmware for the device, most devices don't do any more automatic updates and rely on the user to do that. How are you going to resolve that sort of issue?
I'm sorry, can you repeat?
Yeah, with firmware, if a company does update firmware to address security costs, there's generally a lot of the home routers and that don't do an automatic update. Is there any way to resolve that sort of issue?
Question is automatic updates of firmware. And it's a really good question. There's actually a protocol for that called TRO69. Now TRO69 has 3 components. There's the part that sits inside the device. There's a server that would sit at, say, an ISP. And then there's the ISP who actually has to configure all these things. And earlier in my talk, I talked about there's cases where there are multiple failures. TRO69, if you look at how it's really being implemented, is there are multiple failures everywhere. There are places where it actually works, but there are also a lot of places where they do really stupid things. So, for instance, the communication between the router and the server at the ISP is happening over HTTPS. So, of course, you need a certificate, an SSL certificate at the server side. And in a lot of cases, there have been researchers who've looked at this, and they found that the certificates that were being used were self-signed, which is bad. And you say, oh, yeah, that's really bad because I can go and I can make a self-signed certificate that looks just like that, and I can put the name of the server in there, and the client won't know the difference. But the truth is that the joke is on you, because in these cases, a lot of clients don't even look at the name that's on the certificate. They don't validate anything. They say, oh, there's an SSL certificate. Whoop-de-doo, let's start communicating. So you get a lot of these things where, you know, if there's one problem, the whole protocol is just garbage. But I know, and a lot of researchers have looked at what really goes on in TR-069. Just having one problem is not what happens. You have multiple problems, and it's unfortunate. I think things are getting better. If you look at, as I said before, Google OnHub is one of the new non-standard routers that's being created. It started a few months ago. And they do automatic updates of firmware, and from what I can see, they're doing it right. So this is good. I think in the future it's going to really work, but for right now, it doesn't really work so well. Anybody else? Okay, so thank you very much.
Pero suena, pero déjame ver.